Imagine standing in an open field 1,000 years ago, staring at nothing but grass, mud, and sky. A powerful king has declared that here, on this very spot, a fortress will rise. No cranes, no machines, no modern blueprints, only human hands. Stone by stone, beam by beam. Have you ever wondered how an empty patch of earth became the towering castles that still dot Europe today? Tonight, we'll follow the slow, careful process of building a medieval castle from scratch, from digging ditches and hauling stones to carving out wells, kitchens, and chambers of power. It's not a tale of battles or kings, but of patience, persistence, and the quiet details that turned raw earth into strongholds of history. So settle in as we begin with the very first stone. Chapter 1. When you think of a medieval castle, you probably imagine towering stone walls, thick gates, and battlements looming over the countryside. But before such impressive defenses could rise, before kings and lords could boast of their mighty fortresses, there had to be something much less glamorous: the foundation. The first stones dug and set in the earth determined everything that would come afterward. And in the Middle Ages, without modern machinery, that task was both exhausting and meticulous. To understand how a medieval castle began, you must start with the ground itself. Medieval builders did not choose locations at random. A hilltop might provide a natural advantage, but it could also mean hauling stones uphill with oxen and wagons, a task so grueling that chroniclers recorded delays lasting months. A riverside site offered water, but also risked flooding, forcing builders to divert streams or dig drainage ditches long before any wall could rise. Lords and kings had to balance these considerations: the symbolic power of height, the practicality of water, and the defensive strength of marshes or cliffs. Once the site was chosen, surveyors, often monks or trained clerics with knowledge of geometry, arrived with little more than cords, wooden stakes, and wax tablets for notes. They laid out the footprint of the future castle, walking the earth, stretching their ropes, and hammering markers into the soil. To the untrained eye, this early stage looked like a field full of strings and sticks. But each line represented walls, towers, and courtyards yet to come. If a measurement was wrong here, the error could echo upward into a crooked tower or a leaning wall. Precision mattered, even if achieved with humble tools. The digging then began. Foundations had to be sunk deep enough to hold immense weight. Teams of peasants, sometimes hundreds of them, labored with spades and picks. Without steam shovels or drills, the work was slow, monotonous, and backbreaking. Chroniclers describe men filling baskets of earth, hauling them up ladders, and dumping them into piles that would later serve as ramparts. On wet days, mud clung to their boots and slowed progress. On hot days, the air filled with dust and sweat. Yet this was essential. If the foundations were too shallow, frost or shifting soil could crack the walls. Stone was brought from quarries, often several miles away. Large blocks were too heavy for most carts, so masons sometimes cut them smaller on site, shaping them with hammers and chisels. The sound of tapping stone echoed across the worksite, a constant rhythm of creation. Oxen strained against wooden wagons, and barges floated loads downstream where possible. The closer the quarry, the faster the castle could rise. But not every lord was fortunate enough to build their good stone, and in some places, entire villages were pressed into hauling duty for months at a time. Once stone arrived, foundations were lined with rubble and mortar. Medieval mortar was not like modern cement. It was a careful mixture of lime, sand, and water. Lime itself required burning limestone in a kiln, a process that demanded huge quantities of firewood and days of labor. The mortar bound the rubble together, filling gaps and creating a firm base. Builders often mixed in small stones, shards, and even broken tiles to strengthen the blend. The work was slow, but over time, the trenches filled and the first true lines of the castle became visible. By now, weeks or even months had passed, and yet to an outsider, almost nothing resembling a castle could be seen. Only trenches low, stone walls, and muddy workers bent over their tasks. It was the most boring part of construction, the kind of detail rarely mentioned in romantic stories of knights and battles. But without these hidden foundations, the castle above could not last. And then came the laying of the first dressed stones, the outer face of the walls. These were cut smooth, squared, and carefully fitted. Medieval masons left tiny marks, chisels, initials, or symbols on each block. Some marks identified who cut the stone, ensuring they were paid fairly. Others carried religious meaning. Quiet prayers carved into stone, hidden from sight whence the wall rose higher. Imagine hundreds of these stones, each lifted by hand lever or primitive crane, placed in line and pressed into history. Yet this was only the beginning. For all the effort poured into the ground, one question remained. How did medieval builders move from these hidden, humble foundations to the towering walls that defined the skyline of Europe? Chapter 2. The transition from hidden trenches to visible walls marked the moment when a castle began to look like more than a muddy worksite. For months, or even years, the most important labor remained buried beneath the soil. But once masons began to raise the first walls, the entire community could finally see the promise of the fortress their lord had envisioned. The walls themselves were not single slabs of stone. Instead, medieval masons used a method called ashlar facing with rubble core. Imagine two parallel lines of carefully dressed stone, smooth on the outside, tightly fitted together, squared into clean angles. Between them, the cavity was filled with rubble, broken stone, and mortar. This technique allowed for walls that were enormously thick, sometimes up to 12 feet across, without requiring every inch to be carved into perfect blocks. It was a compromise between strength and efficiency, and it became the standard of castle architecture. Lifting these stones, however, was no simple matter. Without cranes as we know them, builders relied on treadwheel cranes, essentially giant wooden hamster wheels, turned by men walking inside them. As they walked, ropes wound around an axle, raising heavy blocks up the wall. It was slow but effective. The squeak of wooden beams, the groan of ropes, and the creak of pulleys became the soundtrack of construction. For lighter loads, block and tackle systems, levers, and sheer manpower sufficed. Teams of workers strained in unison, guided by the orders of master masons who paced the walls like conductors of a strange, dusty orchestra. While the masons worked stone, carpenters erected scaffolding. These wooden frameworks hugged the growing walls, allowing laborers to climb past materials and chisel stone at ever greater heights. Timber was indispensable, not only for scaffolding but also for centering temporary wooden frames placed under arches until the keystones locked into position. A lord without access to forests had to import wood, sometimes from distant estates, adding another layer of expense and delay. Slowly, the walls grew upward. Each layer was measured, checked, and aligned with remarkable precision given the absence of modern surveying equipment. Builders relied on simple plumb lines, water levels, and square frames to ensure straightness. Mistakes could be catastrophic. A misaligned wall might lean or buckle, wasting months of labor. Medieval chroniclers note instances where entire sections had to be torn down and rebuilt, a costly embarrassment for both the masons and the lord funding the project. But castles were not only walls. Towers soon began to take shape, protruding outward to provide defensive angles. A round tower, though harder to build than a square one, resisted siege weapons more effectively by deflecting blows and preventing undermining. Inside spiral staircases wound upward, always turning clockwise so that right-handed defenders had the advantage against attackers climbing the steps. Even these details were planned early, cut into the stones as they rose with the wall. As walls climbed higher, so did the demands on logistics. Feeding the workers became a full-time endeavor. A building site with hundreds of laborers required bread ovens, beer barrels, and salted meat in vast quantities. Villagers were often compelled to deliver food as part of their feudal duties. In many ways, a castle's kitchen was born long before its stones formed the actual kitchen hall. Records from English estates show expenses for flour, ale, and fish specifically allocated to castle construction camps, as though the workforce itself was another army that needed constant supply, and while the masons and carpenters took pride in their work, the laborers bore the hardest tasks. These men, often peasants hired during agricultural downtime, carried stone, mixed mortar, hauled timber, and dug trenches. Payment was modest, sometimes coin, sometimes food and drink, but for many, it was preferable to the uncertainty of farming alone. Still, the risks were real. Falling from scaffolding, being crushed by stone, or suffering exhaustion in the heat of summer were common hazards. Castles, like wars, consumed lives in ways not always recorded. The progress of construction could be measured season by season. In spring, digging and quarrying resumed after winter frost. Summer was the most productive, when long daylight hours allowed continuous labor. Autumn slowed the pace as harvest drew men back to fields. Winter often forced a halt, especially in northern Europe, when frozen ground and bitter winds made mortar unreliable. Castles, therefore, rose in stages, often over decades, shaped as much by the rhythms of farming and weather as by a lord's ambition. To stand at such a site during these years would not have felt glorious. Dust filled the air. The smell of lime kilns, burning day and night, lingered over the fields. The clatter of chisels, the thud of hammers, the creak of carts, these sounds replaced birdsong. And yet, amid the monotony, small details gave meaning. Masons carved their marks. Laborers left footprints hardened in drying mortar. Carpenters notched beams with distinctive cuts. Though anonymous in chronicles, each worker left a trace within the rising walls. By the time walls reached their full height, the castle's outline commanded the landscape. Villagers who once saw only strings and stakes in the earth now saw battlements against the sky. For the lord who commissioned the work, this transformation carried both political and symbolic weight. The castle was not merely a house of stone. It was a statement of authority, a visual reminder of power. Even before its gates closed against enemies, it served its purpose as a beacon of control. And yet, for all this effort, one problem lingered. Castles were not only walls and towers. They had to function as living spaces. Kitchens, wells, chapels, and great halls were essential, each demanding its own specialized construction. How could builders, already stretched thin by walls and towers, also provide for the daily needs of those who would live within? The answer lay in the next phase of construction, one less visible from the outside, but just as critical. After foundations and walls came the heart of the castle, the interior. Section 3. Once the walls and towers stood firm, a castle was only half a fortress. To live, rule, and defend from within those walls required a second wave of building, the interior spaces. This stage transformed the castle from a shell of stone into a functioning world of its own, where lords, soldiers, servants, and prisoners would each have their appointed places. At the heart of nearly every castle lay the Great Hall. It was the symbolic center of power, where the lord presided, where meals were taken, and where justice was dispensed. Its construction required long beams of timber to span wide spaces, high windows for light, and a raised dais for the lords. Chair. Carpenters labored to fit rafters. Masons carved fireplaces large enough to roast oxen, and glaziers, if the lord was wealthy enough, installed panes of colored glass in narrow slits. For most castles, however, these windows remained open or covered with oiled parchment, allowing in both light and drafts. Beyond the hall, other chambers took form: chapels, kitchens, storerooms, and private rooms. Each had its own peculiar needs. The chapel required fine carving, niches for altars, and careful alignment so that the apse faced east. The kitchen needed massive hearths, stone sinks for washing, and channels for draining wastewater. Storerooms demanded cool, dark vaults, sometimes dug directly into the earth beneath the walls. Even the private chamber of the Lord was modest by modern standards, often a room warmed only by one fireplace, with tapestries hung to soften the cold of bare stone. Among the most important features was the well. Without water, no castle could withstand a siege. Digging a well inside the walls was an ordeal that sometimes took years. In chalk or soft soil, progress might be steady, but in rocky regions, masons advanced inch by inch, hammering through stone. Wells could sink more than 100 feet deep, lined with masonry to prevent collapse. Until it was complete, a castle remained. Vulnerable, for attackers who poisoned or cut off outside water could starve defenders into surrender. Equally crucial was sanitation, though medieval solutions were simple at best. Latrines, called garderobes, were narrow chambers built into the thickness of the wall, with chutes dropping waste directly into the moat or a cesspit. Some garderobes were even cantilevered over cliff edges, relying on gravity to carry waste away. For builders, designing these shafts required care. A misplaced chute could foul a storeroom or taint a well. All of these additions meant that castle interiors were not purely defensive, but deeply practical. A lord could not expect loyalty from soldiers or comfort for family without spaces for sleep, worship, and nourishment. Thus, kitchens and bakehouses bustled with activity, often before the stonework of towers was even finished. Breweries and granaries were planned with as much attention as battlements. In a way, survival inside the walls mattered just as much as resisting the enemy beyond them. Still, not every space was built for comfort. The dungeon, contrary to later myths, was usually a simple storage vault or pit beneath a tower, pressed into service for holding prisoners. Some were little more than windowless rooms, damp and foul-smelling, accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling. They were not designed for extended stays, but as holding cells until ransom or judgment was arranged. For masons, creating these spaces meant carving out underground chambers, often with nothing but chisels and oil lamps. As the interior took shape, the final touches to defense came into place. Battlements crowned the walls with alternating crenellations, merlons, to hide behind, and braziers to shoot through. Wooden hoardings, temporary galleries projecting from the walls, allowed defenders to drop stones or boiling water directly on attackers. Later, stone machicolations replaced them, permanent overhangs with murder holes cut into their floors. Each of these details had to be designed, measured, and carefully aligned during construction, long before the castle's first true test in battle. By this point, the worksite had been active for years, sometimes decades. Whole generations of laborers might be involved, fathers beginning the foundations, sons raising towers, and grandsons completing the final gatehouse. Chroniclers note that some castles took so long to complete that the lord who commissioned them never lived to see them finished. Others, begun in haste during war, remained incomplete, abandoned as half-built shells when peace returned or funds ran dry. But for those that did reach completion, the first moment of use was profound. The Lord would precess into the great hall, perhaps with clergy blessing the stones, villagers watching from the fields, and banners unfurled over the towers. The castle had moved from dream to reality, a permanent mark on the landscape. From then on, it was not merely stone but a symbol of permanence, control, and resilience. And yet, the story of building was never truly finished. Castles evolved, altered by new weapons, changing tastes, and shifting fortunes. A tower added here, a wall thickened there, a gatehouse reinforced with iron. Each generation left its mark, just as each generation had left footprints in the mortar during construction. Looking back, it is easy to imagine castles as timeless, unchanging relics of stone. But in truth, They were works in progress, shaped by weather, by war, by wealth, and by the ordinary rhythm of human labor. Each stone bore the weight of countless hands, each wall the result of compromise between ambition and practicality. The question then lingers, when a castle was finally declared finished, was it ever truly complete? Or was it simply ready for the next stage in its long, restless life? And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. I hope these quiet details of the past helped you unwind and drift a little closer to rest. If you enjoyed spending this time together, I'd love for you to join me again. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps this channel grow, and it means I can keep sharing more calm, sleepy histories with you. Until next time, may your night be peaceful and your dreams be gentle. Good night.